Hi there, and welcome to my talk on routes into web development. First of all, who am I? So I am Mike Steer. I am a geek, or as my professional title is Head of Ecommerce for Riverr. So what I'm going to be talking about today is how I got into web development originally, but then also talking about potential paths that might be useful for you guys as well. So if I start at the very beginning in the early years, when I was a nipper, my dad there was sporting an awesome moustache. My first experience of computing was this little baby here, the Amstrad CPC 464, which you could probably do some really basic Clark-wide editing and kind of Excel stuff on there, or pre-Excel. But I used to use it for playing games, really basic games, as you can kind of tell from this picture. But it was kind of my first kind of introduction to computing, and playing around with it and kind of seeing what you could do with computers, and that kind of kickstarted, I suppose, a lifelong obsession with computers and games and whatnot. If we kick forward a few years, I left school in the mid-90s, when the internet was kind of still, very early in its kind of inception. There weren't really many internet-based jobs around, certainly none that were kind of obvious as they are now. So I knew that I wanted to go into some sort of IT stuff, so I ended up doing a 2-year GMVQ in IT, just a very general one, and ended up getting a job doing kind of general IT work. So during my working years, I'd spent a number of years jumping between, I suppose, different IT jobs because I couldn't quite find one that I really enjoyed doing. And when you spend most of your working life, working, it seemed to me that I needed to find something that I really enjoyed. And I didn't really enjoy what I did. I found that I was generally learning most of what I was doing in a job within the first 6 months or so. And then beyond that, it got quite boring because it didn't really change much. Nothing really evolved. So I'd kind of learnt what I was going to be doing for the next 30, 40 years. So that was quite depressing. So I thought, you know what, let's try and find something that I enjoy doing and wake up every morning wanting to do. So by fluke, a friend of mine wanted some help with a website he was building and some assistance on it. So I didn't really know anything about it, but I kind of muddled through and kind of done what he wanted. And in doing so, I kind of realised I actually really enjoyed doing the coding side of it. So I thought, let's see if I can make a career out of it. So from the getting into it kind of side of it, I thought, right, I know I want to code, but beyond that, I have no idea which direction to go. What language do I learn? What do I need to know? What do I not need to know? So I looked at the different careers that are available, the different salaries and stuff. And I was trying to get an idea on actually, I need to work out where I go because learning something is challenging. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and I didn't want to waste time learning something that I ultimately didn't need to know. So I kind of broke it down a little bit into what considerations I needed to think about when working out which kind of tech stack and which kind of road to go down. So I started looking at things like salaries, both initially for kind of new starters, but also further down the line in terms of like what do seniors get paid, what do lead developers get paid, what's the kind of career progression down that road. Salary shouldn't be the be all and end all. Like, you should always enjoy what you do. I think beyond the monetary aspect, the money's nice, but ultimately you need to enjoy what you do. And if you enjoy what you do, then it'll never feel like work. It will feel like just fun. So it's something to consider. It's a big thing to consider, but it shouldn't be your only consideration. Other things like demand and saturation are really important as well. So, for example, PHP roles, there's a massive demand for because it's a really popular skill. So there'll be lots of people looking for PHP developers. But equally, there's quite a saturated market in that there's going to be lots of people with that qualification or with those skills that will be applying for those roles as well. So it's key to kind of find a balance between finding a skill that is in demand, but also not everybody has. So it's trying to find what works for you in terms of finding a little niche in the market. Also the community, so PHP and general developer communities will be there to support you. So on the newer tech side of things, the communities will be smaller because the technology is new. On more established communities, for things like PHP, will be kind of a lot wider, and they can help for things when you're trying to debug stuff. People have probably had the same issue as you before, so things like that just make it a lot easier when you've got a more established community. So it's something to consider. Which takes us to the Labyrinth. The Labyrinth is trying to work out which route you go down when you're starting out, because there is an enormous amount of stuff to learn, and it's as important to try and work out what is good to learn as what is not good to learn, in terms of what things you need to think about and what things you can go, actually I don't need to know that now, so I'll leave that for now. So with some good prep, you can kind of make a good action plan. The lines are getting blurred in terms of these items here, but traditionally you'd consider things like front end and back end as being two clear separations of how kind of web works. So I'll go into those now. So the front end essentially is all the stuff that the customer sees, whoever goes onto the website. It's the visual aspect of it. So it's the the homepage, all the images, the text, everything you see, any banners, any kind of visual things on the website, and that's been taken from generally a designed image that a designer's made in something like Photoshop or a newer tech like Figma or Adobe XD. And then it will be a front-end developer who will take that image, cut it up into different sections and make it into HTML and CSS and JavaScript to basically make it an interactive kind of page. And they'll be able to add kind of more flair to it. So it's good for creative people, creative minds, people that can kind of visualize stuff and put their own kind of visual stamp on it. Things you'll need to know, so obviously HTML, CSS, the building blocks of the web page that you'll need to know, understanding of things like Photoshop or Figma, so you can take those designs, cut them up and then turn them into HTML. Knowledge of JavaScript. So JavaScript is something that is it's quite an old technology in terms of the web, but it's had a resurgence in sort of the last few years with things like React and Vue, and they're really powering some new kind of trends in terms of how the front end is built. So understanding of JavaScript, it is more of a programming kind of side of it than the HTML, CSS and the design, but it's something that is becoming more and more useful. So a potential route in to start with would be to understand the basics of HTML, CSS and JavaScript. Beyond that, you could then go into deeper dives in things like CSS, where you've got frameworks. So the frameworks like Foundation and Bootstrap here allow you to hook into these existing libraries, and basically they do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So if you were to make a website and you wanted it to be responsive, so it works on mobile and desktop, these guys do a lot of the work for you, so you can hook into that rather than having to write everything from scratch. You've also got preprocessors, so these are things like SAS and LS, which are two versions of the same sort of thing. These basically extend what you can do with CSS and just make it easier to write and more powerful. So again, you can do more with less code. You also have things like JavaScript. So you've got task runners. So these are basically things that you can bolt on that basically will compile down the CSS and the JavaScript that you write into something that's cross-browser compatible, so you haven't got to worry about how things are going to work on a version of Internet Explorer versus Chrome or Safari. They'll make things more standardized. They'll also package it down into a small minified file, so it's less weight for the browser to open up. And then you've got different libraries. So jQuery was one that has been probably in use for the last 10 years or so. It's been really popular, but it is of late being replaced with things like Vue and React, which are a new modern approach to how the front end is being displayed. So these are all things to kind of bear in mind that you might start to pick up as you're looking into the front end side of things. From a back-end point of view, it's much more kind of logical and functional, and kind of you're looking at things like security, authentication, logic, so how things work with connecting to the databases, show this particular thing if you're logged in as this person. Then it's far less visual, far more in the code and kind of how things work. It's really good for people that are logical, kind of problem solvers, all that kind of stuff that you kind of understand. Like you can look at a puzzle and kind of stand back and go, right, okay, if I move that bit over here, move it over there, how do these things connect to each other? In terms of the good skill set to have, so it's good to have an understanding of at least a programming language, so whether that's Python, PHP, ASP. We'll get into those in a bit. But having an understanding of those core things like how an if statement works, so if this happens, then do this, otherwise do this, or loops, so how you loop through stuff to get like a list of things out, understanding how they work. And they're very transferable things. So if you learn it in PHP, the same concepts will be the same in Python. It will just be a slightly different syntax. Things like relation databases as well, so how you store that data. It's an understanding how you don't necessarily know how to set up and create the databases, but how things can be saved and retrieved from databases is really important. How that might look in terms of the different paths you go down. So you've got the languages. There are many languages from a backend point of view. These are four of the main ones: PHP, Python, Ruby, and ASP. Off the back of those main languages, they'll have frameworks. So these are some PHP ones. There'll be different libraries for different frameworks for different languages. But these essentially are built on top of the language, and they just add additional functionality. So in the same way that the Sass or the CSS ones with Foundation and Bootstrap work, these come with a load of functionality out of the box. So rather than you having to write everything from scratch, you can just set up a Laravel, for example, framework. And then a lot of things like the routing, how the pages are displayed, the authentication, all that kind of stuff comes as part of it. So it just means that out of the box you've got a lot more. Off you go. You've also then got package managers. So each language will have its own package manager. Composer is the one for PHP, and these basically hook you up to a lot of individual pieces of code that community has written for lots of different things, whether it's connecting to Google or pulling in images in from Instagram. They will be individual bits of code that you can basically pull into your project, again, to save you having to write them from scratch. So all of these things are kind of designed to help you code more quicker. On the database side of things, you've traditionally got relational databases. So all of these do a similar sort of thing. They're relational databases. They're quite structured and quite formulaic in terms of how they structure the data that's stored in them. Conversely, you've got no SQL databases, which allow you to, if you're not entirely sure, if your data doesn't fit a structure, you can then just chuck this data in whatever state it is into a non-SQL database. There are some downsides, and for each of these, it would depend on the use case you're using, but you do need to be aware that there are different types of database out there and what are the pros and cons and why you choose one over the other. So there's a lot of information there. On the testing side of things, there's a lot of stuff we can do in terms of adding tests to our code so that if we introduce a bug, it's picked up on in the test rather than in the website. So things like unit tests, integration tests, functional tests. A unit test is where you test a specific function of a piece of code. So this piece of code deals with generating an offer number. So you'd be able to test that in isolation to the rest of the system. You'd just be able to put something into it and expect something to come out of it. So they normally would be covered across the site in lots of individual unit tests, just to test a very specific part of the code. Integration tests are when you're integrating a piece of work into the main body of work, and it will just make sure that what you've put in there doesn't break what's already there. And functional tests are very much along the lines of you've built a new function into the system, whether it's adding a new button that clicks off to somewhere. It's very much testing against what that function is and does it do what it's supposed to. All those are tests that can be added to the system, but rather than running them manually, we can hook them up to something like Jenkins, which is an automation tool that basically allows us to, every time we make a change to the system, it will run through all of the tests and make sure that what we've added hasn't introduced any bugs. And if it is, it picks it up straight away so we can then address it straight away before it gets into kind of production. On another side of things, we've got servers. So obviously the website needs to run on a server. Servers can be either a Linux-based server or a Windows-based server. There's pros and cons to each. Traditionally, most web servers have been Linux, but there will be occasions where you need to run it on a Windows server. Under Linux, there's lots of different flavors of Linux. So Ubuntu, CentOS, Debian, they're kind of the main ones, but there's lots of other different ones. Again, all kind of do the same thing, but some of the syntax, some of the codes you write will all be different. So it's something to bear in mind. And then to make it a web server, you need to have a service like Apache or Nginx running on them, so that when the request comes into the server, it knows how to process it and how to route it into the right place so that you then get the right website up. So yeah, that's a lot of information from front end to back end to testing to servers. It's kind of overwhelming, and it's quite easy to panic. But don't, because you don't need to know all of that. You may never need to know all of that. Depending on which route you go down, if you're going down more of a front end route, then you may do much more on the front end side of it and have an idea about the servers and that side of thing, but you don't really have to take a deep dive in it because it's not going to be something that affects your day to day. Conversely, if you go into more of a DevOps role, you're looking at the servers, you're looking at the infrastructure, and you're looking at all that side of things, but you don't really touch on the front end side of it. Or you might go a bit more full stack and kind of understand kind of across all of it. So you understand how to set up the front end, the back end, how they connect to each other, and do a bit of that. So it's important to kind of work out where you want to go. So what you could look at as a starting point is you want to pick a language. So let's start with PHP. It's very widely adopted. There's lots of resources out there for it. You pick a framework to give you a head start and to give you a bit of out-the-box information. So Laravel, again, is very well established. It's got a great community. There's lots of tutorials out there for it. What you don't have in Laravel, but you need, so for instance, the Facebook connection or the Instagram feed, don't write it yourself. You pull it in via package managers. That gives you all the functionality you need. And then say you want to store some information, some user data or some orders or whatever, you set up a database and you go, actually, MySQL is a really standard database. We can set it up to track the information that we want in there. And there you have a complete kind of application. You've got your PHP language, you've got your framework, you've got any additional stuff you need pulled in via package managers, and you've got your database to store the information. Without needing to worry about the servers, the front end, all that kind of stuff, you've got a simple application there. In terms of moving forward and where you get to learn this information, I guess, there's a load of free stuff out there. Obviously YouTube is a great resource for that kind of thing. Things like CodePen, they're not tutorials, but it does give you a place to test your code online and kind of see it live. There's obviously a lot of paid stuff out there. Udemy's quite good. They do a sale every other day, so it's always worth keeping an eye on that. But there's lots of resources out there nowadays for learning in your own time, which kind of takes us into being a developer, I guess, and what we do kind of, I guess, on a day-to-day basis. So what you typically be looking at is a mixture, really. So on any given day, you might be building a completely new system from scratch based on a requirement, either an internal thing or something for a client. You'll be maintaining existing stuff for clients, which might be a mixture of adding new functionality into that existing system based on a specific requirement from a client, or some bug fixes and issues come in. They're getting an error or something weird's happening. You need to investigate it, fix it, and then deploy it. And then also researching and testing new tech. It's a really big part of being a developer, is keeping an eye out on what's coming next and making sure you're up to date on new tech. So the takeaways, not that kind of takeaway, are commit to learning. So as I said before, in my previous tasks, in my previous roles and jobs, non-developer, I'd learnt what I'd needed to learn within the job quite quickly, and I found that really boring after that, because you just end up doing the same thing on repeat. So you need to, in this career, keep ahead of the curve and look at what's coming next and then learn it, and keep an eye on, where new trends are going to be, because it's always evolving. Persistence, especially initially, I think, when you're learning something new like coding, it can be quite daunting, but it does start to drop quite quickly, and once you kind of get that understanding of it, it does get easier, but it's important to kind of stick with it initially, especially. When you are, however you choose to do your learning, it's important to get stuck in. I used to watch a lot of videos without coding along, and I'd realised that within a couple of days I'd completely forgotten what I was doing. So it's really important to make sure you code along when you're doing these things, because it might be things like the video you're using or the book is on a slightly different version, and you'll come across little weird quirks and errors, and it's looking at those errors and working out how you fix them is how you end up learning more, and it actually sticks alongside it by actually doing it all. Again, keep looking ahead. You always need to be looking at kind of what the next tech is, and how it could be useful. There will be stuff that comes and goes ultimately, so it's also key to work out what is looking like it has legs and which is going to be around for a little while, rather than jumping ship every 5 minutes, because there's always something new. It's as much about understanding what adds value and what is likely to stay around for a while. And yeah, it's the development is the future. The internet is the future. People need it. It's integrated into every facet of our lives nowadays. So it's not going anywhere. So what next for you guys, I guess? The big question, I suppose, is university or a self-taught route the right way to go? And the answer, the simple answer, is there is no right or wrong. University has its pros. It will give you exposure to areas that you wouldn't necessarily think about doing yourself, some of which may be useful, some of which may not, but ultimately it does give you a broader exposure to computer science. It can be more interactive, depending on whether they have in-person sessions, but it can be more interactive and more kind of collaborative by having that kind of feel of it being in a classroom and talking about stuff rather than working remotely. And you do get a degree at the end of it, which in a lot of cases will open doors that otherwise might be shut. It's not the way that it used to be in terms of you had a degree, it was a guaranteed job, but it does open some doors that potentially might be shut otherwise. And then the self-taught route, if you have an idea of what you want to do, you want to become a React developer or a mobile app developer or anything along those lines. If you know you want to do that, then you can be a lot more specific in terms of what you learn, and you can get there a lot faster, rather than going on a uni course and teaching you a lot more erroneous stuff. It's obviously less expensive than uni. And you can learn it alongside another career. So if you were doing something else and you weren't sure if it was the right way to go, you could do this other job and learn in your own time. It is hard to do it in your own time in evenings and weekends, but it is possible, and it does give you that option of learning alongside to work out if you actually do enjoy doing it before you take it as a full-time thing. In terms of the people I've worked with over the last 10-15 years in development, it's probably a 50-50 split in terms of the people that have gone to uni and those who haven't. So there's no clear defined path. It's not really a right or wrong answer. It really depends on kind of what you want to do and which path you want to go down. And with that, it's the end. Thank you for listening to my talk.